Equi-Force and Dr. Amy Gill. Tonight's topic is going to be healthy gut and healthy horse. Just for some quick housekeeping tools, if you guys have questions, go ahead and you can type them into the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to them either towards the end of the presentation or during the presentation as needed. But for right now, I'm just going to hand it over to Dr. Gill and let her take it away from there.
All right, thank you, Chad. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And yeah, I always like to have an interactive conversation whenever I give a talk or seminar. So as I'm talking and something pops into your mind that you want to ask a question about, feel free to just do it right then and there. It always makes for a much more lively and interesting conversation if we keep it in real time. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about what the contemporary concepts are in helping horses to get healthy or stay healthy when they are in a performance type setup. A lot of horses that I deal with on a day-to-day basis are dealing with a huge amount of stress, and I've always felt like stress is the #1 undoer of good performance in horses. And even in the best managed stables where the horses are really attended to correctly, it's very difficult to control the effects of being in confinement, living in a stall for a large portion of their day, and just being fed foods that really are good for them, but not necessarily what they normally would eat if they were free ranging or browsing. And just basically talk about what kind of the main issues are that we face today with the modern performance horse that's living in a very controlled and micromanaged environment, and some of the new technology and information and nutrients that we can use to help prevent disorders from happening, and also to help horses get over specific problems that they might be having. So we all know from many years of reading lots of interesting articles on the internet that horses are strict herbivores. They can only eat plant material. They're not designed to eat any other type of animal or fish products. So we are very limited in what we can feed them, and the way in which we feed them and the manner in which they consume these feeds is equally as important as actually what they're eating. So with these horses that live in confinement, they're generally fed 2 times a day, maybe 3 times a day, and if they're really, really lucky, they get 4 separate feedings a day. And I try very much to encourage all of you, if you have a horse in training that lives predominantly in a stall, to try to break up the feeding into smaller, more frequent meals. And there's several reasons for this. I'm sure everyone already is well aware of the fact that as a grazing herbivore, the horse is supposed to have a pretty constant flow of digestive through the tract. So the more often you feed them, the better you're going to be able to simulate that. But also from a digestion standpoint, if a horse has to eat a lot of food on a daily basis in order to obtain calories and nutrients to meet its requirements, it's very hard to put a large amount of food in front of a horse and get a good quality level of digestibility out of it. So small meals more frequently are very, very important in a stable horse's life, from not only the standpoint of the horse liking fresh, novel foods more frequently instead of having 2 large portions a day where they push it around for a while and then it's old. A lot of horses aren't interested in their food after it's been sitting there for a while, to the fact that the digestibility of the food actually is improved if they eat it in much smaller quantities. Now, in my travels, and I mostly deal with high-level performance horses, I spend a lot of time at the racetrack in Kentucky, New York, and Florida. and quite a bit of time in show horse barns too. Right now I'm in South Florida for the winter, and so I spend a good deal of time in Wellington, and also there's a lot of racehorses down here that are at training centers, and they're all running at Gulfstream Park. So I see a wide variety of horses, but I see kind of the same problems over and over and over again. And again, I really feel like most of it goes back to just a super high level of stress, and stress causes a lot of inflammation in the horse's digestive tract. That's just a natural reaction. When you have a high level of stress, you secrete a hormone called cortisol, and cortisol is very useful on a short-term basis to help you deal with stress. But in these horses that have very high levels of circulating cortisol almost all the time, it ends up having an effect on the physiology of the horse all over, but a very profound negative effect on the digestive tract. So the inflammatory process starts, and it's not really noticeable on the exterior of the horse. The horse is still looking good, still doing really well. But you have what we call a subclinical level of abnormal physiology, and over time that's going to catch up to the horse, and then eventually you'll see something happen, whether it's got chronic little gas colic bouts, or just starts to not really perform very well, just backing out of the feed tub. And a lot of different things are going to start to go on at this point. We do see a lot of, obviously, gastric ulceration in horses that are fed episodically and kept in stalls and enduring a large amount of training, and that's very stressful. And we also see colonic ulcers, so that's the hindgut and the colon, also profoundly affected. And so these are two areas, the forestomach, the intestinal tract, the small intestine and the large intestine, where we really want to try to deal with controlling inflammation is probably the number one thing that I work on at this point. So we talk about the management of the horse, freeing the horse of as much stress as possible. And granted, it's very difficult in these performance horse barns to do a lot of that. That's just the way it is. There's a lot of horses. It's very intense. They have to travel. They're micromanaged. They're working really hard. It's hard to feed them correctly because it's a labor issue. So we talk a lot about the ways that we can try to help the horse as much as possible to free it of as much stress as possible. One of the things that we see now are more and more people utilizing round pens to turn a horse out in. We see it at the racetrack even, and they've finally come around where they have set up round pens so the horse can be, put in polo bandages and some bell boots and turned out and allowed to feel good and be free of having someone hanging on its face all the time and always being in a halter or a bridle. It's really, really important. The other thing is we're starting to see stables that are set up where horses can see each other, not just where they stick their head out and turn the corner and see a horse, but where there actually are partitions where they can see each other and touch each other and act a little bit more like the herd animal that they are. Very, very hard on a horse to live isolated. Horses depend on each other for survival as herd animals and animals of prey. They have to have some communication between them in order for all of them to survive. They have not evolved out of that. And when we take that away from them, we create a lot of stress. So again, being able to kind of get out, be a horse, roll around in the sand a little bit, see your neighbor, feeding more frequently, smaller meals, especially when it comes to the concentrate portion of the diet, which I'm going to touch on a little bit as far as what that should be comprised of nowadays. And then also making sure that forage is available at all times. So moving forward here, we want to make sure that the actual environment the horse lives in is as comfortable for them as we can make it. I know at the racetrack or in some of these show barns, I say the horse, take the horse out and let it walk for 45 minutes or graze in the afternoon if it gets ridden in the morning, or take it on a hack especially if there's an individual that really is expressing a lot of difficulty in handling living in a very controlled environment. So the more the horse can get out of the stall, the better, whether it means turn out in the afternoon in a paddock, with a buddy, by itself, next to a buddy. It's up to the horse owner, trainer, breeder, manager to figure out what's best for each individual horse. And every horse is going to behave differently. Some horses thrive on living in a very controlled environment, and others really hate it. So it's all a matter of that individual horse. So that's the number one thing that I always try to look at when I head out to a consultation, is how is the environment and what can we do to make those horses more comfortable. And then we look at the actual, what are we feeding, and is it appropriate for the type of horse that we're feeding? Because some horses need very, very high quality, chocked full of a lot of calories and a lot of nutrients in their diet, and others need to be able to just munch along during the day on sort of a low quality fiber forage product without a lot of calories. So you've got to be able to identify what type of horse you're dealing with, what is required of them, and what kind of intake do they need to have. Not all horses are created the same. I have a thoroughbred off the track who is very hard to keep weight on or to put weight on, and then the other horse I have is an Appaloosa, and so we all know how difficult it is to manage those horses because they tend to not be able to eat very much without getting fat. But one of the key things is make sure that you have the right type of product going to the horse, because one of the things that I've learned through the years is calorie or forage or feed restriction is a big no-no. We actually slow the horse's metabolic rate if we start to restrict how much it eats. So in the old days, we used to say put a muzzle on the horse, or just only allow it 1 or 2 flakes of hay in the morning. That's actually turned out to be a disaster in a lot of different ways. From a behavioral standpoint, a lot of horses end up developing behavioral issues because they do end up with ulcers, and they're very uncomfortable. They're emotionally distraught when they don't have food. So the key is finding the right feedstuffs to be able to utilize them maximally for the type of horse that you're feeding. Race horses get one thing, show horses get another. Different breeds have different metabolic rates, but the last thing you ever want to do is deprive a horse of food at any time. They should be able to eat all the time, and you just have to make sure that you're supporting them correctly. And that is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but again, there are many different ways to tackle it from a management standpoint. We do have slow feeders now, slow feeding hay nets. And there's also some level of nutrient targeting that we do to help increase the metabolic rate and allow certain horses that tend to want to be really on the heavy side live more like a normal horse and not deal with all of the stress that comes from food restriction, which leads to all the things I talked to earlier, with the cortisol levels going up, inflammation in the gut, leading to metabolic issues. So from there, we'll talk a little bit about, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in there. Happy to answer them as we go along. So the main thing that we're worried about now is really keeping the inflammation in the gut down and keeping the horse eating all the time and eating the correct type of food. So I think we've covered that pretty well. Some of the things that I want to talk about now are what we can do to augment the diet with some specific nutrients that have been clinically studied, not necessarily always in the horse, but in multiple species that have been shown to be useful as addition into the diet to help prevent some of the disorders that we see occurring in horses. And of course, we all know about the metabolic horse and how that can end up leading to not only complete digestive disaster and disorder, but also it can end up leading to laminitis in the horse. So that's the end result, and we want to try to avoid that at all times. So we'll talk a little bit about, because I think most people probably are dealing with this at one level or another, the horse that really doesn't get enough exercise, probably lives somewhat confined or confined all the time, and therefore is being fed very little, which, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of heading down the wrong path altogether. Horses like that need to be managed a little bit differently, because long term you're going to end up with a horse that falls apart in one way or another. And so we're looking at using concentrates or supplements that don't supply calories. And so one of the things that we really recommend now, and this was something that came about probably in the last 10 years, is using a ration balancer that basically contains vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and some other nutrients, maybe some probiotics or enzymes I've seen in some of the products, which I'm not really a fan of putting those types of things into the ration balancer. But basically what you're trying to do is just cover the horse's nutrient requirements, meaning vitamins, minerals, amino acids, in a very small concentrated portion, and not adding any additional calories through grain or super fibers or fats. So these horses that are kind of heavy duty and easy keepers really don't need to be fed any type of grain or concentrated product. They basically can have all their nutrient requirements met by a ration balancer, and then finding a lower calorie, maybe lower quality forage, so that they can be consuming something all the time. Because like I said, the main thing we don't want to do is slow the metabolic rate down. And when you deprive a horse of food, that's what happens. So you just make the problem worse. And the other thing that I figured out a long time ago, I actually had a horse of my own that was very big, heavy, sort of like Belgian quarter horse cross. I don't know what he was, but he was enormous. And this was back probably in the mid 80s when I was still in graduate school. And he ended up with grass laminitis from over consuming sugars in grass. And it made me start to really investigate there's got to be more to this than what we know right now. And I started really looking at research that was going on in human medicine and human athletes, and came across some information about how people with diabetes tended to have low serum magnesium levels, and that for some reason they responded very positively to magnesium supplementation. And nobody, I don't think, has even really answered the question as to why that exists, but we have a similar pattern in horses, and they do seem to respond very positively to magnesium. And whether it's that increases receptor sites for insulin, or exactly what the mode of action is there, I'm not really sure anybody actually knows, but started looking at using magnesium, and it was it's very effective in horses that have metabolic disorders. So went ahead and started looking at putting together, this was my very first little nutrition supplementation project, putting together a product that could be used for these metabolic horses, and my horse in particular, and came up with a formulation that I'm still using today and is extremely effective in helping these horses that have metabolic issues, particularly the inflammation that comes from the adipose tissue in their bodies and the high cortisol levels. So we do a little bit of magnesium. There's also some cinnamon in there. Cinnamon has been used in human medicine for diabetes as well, and then some powerful antioxidants, lipoic acid, and a couple other ingredients that really just help to stimulate the horse's metabolism and do a better job of regulating glucose and insulin. So that's something else that can be done for these horses that are what we call metabolic syndrome, or have metabolic syndrome and are difficult to manage. I have found it takes about 6 or 8 months for that product to really kick in, but I found that these horses start to have very normal appearance. They lose a lot of that abnormal fat deposition that we see in metabolic horses, and really become a lot healthier when they are receiving the magnesium supplementation and like I said, some of these other things to just sort of help move them along metabolically. So that's something to think about for horses that struggle with metabolic issues. I also tend to want to put them on an omega-3 fatty acid supplement. Again, that is pretty potent for the inflammation in the gut. And I use that a lot at the racetrack and in the show barns as well. A lot of these horses that just have these sort of subclinical gas colic episodes from time to time, and you'll just see a little bit of aggravation from them during high stress periods. They respond very well to the anti-inflammatory effects of omega-3 fatty acids. And again, omega-3s are oils such as flaxseed oil, chia. I think hemp is considered an omega-3. Maybe I'm wrong on that one. I can't remember. But you want to stay away from corn oil and soybean oil, canola oil. Those are all omega-6s, and they don't do anything to help the horse as far as anti-inflammatory effect. And those are the oils that are already in feeds, and they're processed and they're stabilized, and they really do nothing except contribute calories, but they can have a very negative effect in the digestive tract as well, because they are what we call the pro-inflammatory oils. So we really want to stay away from adding any extra fats in the omega-6 category and stay with the omega-3s. And, you know, fish oil is also an omega-3. You get a very high dose of docosahexaenoic acid, but I'm not a fan of feeding fish to horses. You have to deodorize it, and omega-3 fatty acids are very volatile. And once you start to adulterate them and expose them to light, heat, oxygen, they become less and less effective. So I'm a fan of, again, sticking to a strict herbivore diet and using the oils that come from plants to provide the omega-3 fatty acids. So there's some argument there about, you know, how much do they derive of they have to convert the omega-3 in the seed oils into docosahexaenoic acid and the EPA, as opposed to using just straight fish oil, which is already in that form. But I think horses are fairly efficient at that, being obligate herbivores. And in my experience using the flax-based oil that I produce for the last 15 years, I've seen it work very nicely in many, many horses. So I'm pretty sure that they are metabolizing and utilizing that very well.
Hey, Amy.
Yeah.
Question. You want to get to them real quick?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss something?
No. I just said there's a few questions that came in. If you want to answer those real quick, or if you want to wait to the end, that's fine.
I don't know. I don't see. Where do I see them?
I'll just read them out loud to you. So Sue asks, when you talk about metabolic issues in horses, do you include PSSM in this?
Well, I guess you would say that's metabolic because they're producing laying down an abnormal type of glycogen. So, yes, I think categorically that would fit in a metabolic issue. And it's managed in different ways depending upon what type of PSSM it is. But in general, we try to do the same things, and it tends to be very heavy, easy keeping horses. So I would say yes, that is a metabolic issue, although it shows itself in a very specific physiological way. But like tying up is also, I would say, a metabolic issue as well. And that one has a similar outward clinical appearance to PSSM. So, I mean, they're all brought on by genetics and environment, but they all are managed very similarly. So yes, I guess I would have to answer that question as yes, I do feel like it is a metabolic thing.
Sure. And then Anne asks, do you recommend supplementation for a horse that is not metabolic, but gets fat easily and looks like he might be going to have metabolic issues when older? Is it appropriate to use a preventative, or should I wait until he has genuine symptoms?
No, I think you should have to start thinking about it in utero. That's why if you have a pregnant mare who's already a big horse and she tends to throw big babies, then we need to be worrying about her at that point before that baby's even born, because I think a lot of things happen in utero that set them up later on down the line for being a metabolic horse to begin with. And again, the main thing is, I don't recommend using any grain at all. There's so many different feeds now out there where you can supply calories in the form of fat and fiber. I'm totally off grain. Even for race horses, I've seen many a racehorse now that I've worked with that doesn't eat grain. They manage to eat enough calories from fat and super fibers. And that's a big part of the metabolic syndrome, is that horses were never meant to eat anything that had that much sugar in it. They're very inefficient at processing sugar. They don't know how to, they don't have the capability of moving it in and out of their digestive tract very well. And that system becomes more and more sluggish over time when they're constantly having to deal with sugar in the diet. So, that's the kind of thing. Yes, don't feed horses a lot of sugar when they're babies. Don't feed them a lot of sugar at all, sugar and starch. They don't need it. There's so many alternatives now. And then as far as a horse like that is concerned, you've got to be aware that it's going to have the low starch and sugar feeds. It may need to be on a metabolic supplement as early as 2 or 3 years of age if you're starting to see physical signs that it's going to start accumulating abnormal adipose tissue. There's nothing wrong with being proactive. I do recommend, the omega-3 fatty acid supplements and the metabolic product that I make called Metallibrium in young horses that are, potentially genetically predisposed to becoming metabolic horses.
She does say that he gets hay and a balancer now, no grain. So
yeah,
track there.
Yeah, definitely. Those kind of horses, they don't need to eat any type of grain, and unless they're working so hard that they're really, having a hard time maintaining calories. But generally, forage. If your horse can maintain its ideal weight on forage, then all you need is a ration balancer. Forage is the most important part of the diet, and picking the right type of forage for the type of horse you're dealing with is the most important thing. It's not the concentrate that matters. It's the forage, and then just balancing with some ration balancer, and then utilizing the nutrient targeting to deal with the metabolic, growth, immune, whatever type of disorder it is that you're going to be dealing with. We can target specific nutrients for those things, but the main thing is to get the base diet correct.
Sure.
Okay. Anybody else how come I can't see the questions?
Under questions, under little menu there.
Okay. Oh, well, next time. Okay, so we kind of covered the chubby horse and the issues with the metabolic syndrome. The young growing horse, if people have babies, again, we just kind of touched on that a little bit. The health and the well-being of that baby starts in utero. It's not at age 4 when all of a sudden you realize it has a metabolic syndrome issue. So some of the things that we like to really pay attention to are making sure that the broodmare is not insulin resistant and metabolic, because that can really affect the growth and health of the fetus. So that's the first place you start there. And again, a lot of broodmares do just fine on pasture, forage, and ration balancer. There's no reason why a mare has to be eating a large amount of concentrate. I'm starting to finally see a lot of people backing off of the concentrate and just using the ration balancer, especially for the first 8 months of the pregnancy. You know, once you hit lactation, it might be a little different, but honestly, I see a lot of mares that do just fine on ration balancer, even when they're in the first trimester of pregnancy. If they have good quality forage and pasture. If they don't, then you have to look at it differently. If you have a broodmare that's not on good quality pasture, then you probably would have to look at using some type of a concentrate that has calories in it in the form of fiber and fat. But again, stay away from grain altogether. And same with the feeding of the young horse. Doesn't have to have grain in it. It can just be beet pulp, rice bran, soybean hulls. Those things are all fiber, but they provide the horse with a decent amount of calories. They're all fermented fibers, and so the volatile fatty acids that are produced from the fermentation of those fibers by the microbes give the horse plenty of material to produce energy and other things from. So that's the route you want to go. The most natural way for the horse to eat is, and even at a young age, the babies are a little less capable of really good fermentation. So you have to supply them with very high quality forage like alfalfa hay. But the more natural you can feed them by just using fiber and fat, which is not necessarily a natural thing, but it doesn't affect the horse negatively like sugar and starch does. So then moving on from the young horse, and again, if you have a horse that's predisposed to being metabolic, I have no problem with starting them on the metabolic program from the get-go. Immune disorders. Oh, let me go back to bone issues and joint issues. So another area of interest for me way back when, a good friend of mine, Brian Nielsen, was at Texas A&M doing his dissertation research, and he did some work with bioavailable silicon that was really, really interesting. And in 2005, I was approached by, I had written an article for Thoroughbred Times about bone physiology and how to keep bone healthy. And one of the things I touched on was bioavailable silicon. And then I was approached by a company in Europe who was very involved in the agricultural industry, multiple species as well as plants, that had developed a bioavailable silicon product that was working really, really well to help improve the physical structure of plants and also in animals. The one area that was really interesting to me was chickens, broilers, who are grown very, very rapidly to be very, very big, large breasted tissue, and just enormous animals. I'm sure we all, I became a vegan after looking at what goes on in these factory farms. But anyway, one of the problems they have is they can't get up. They get so big so fast they can't stand up. Their legs bend underneath them. And they were able to demonstrate by using the biologically available silicon that they could make their leg bones a lot stronger so that these poor birds could actually stand up and move around. And that was some pretty serious research. And I thought, well, you know, that's been shown clinically to be the real thing, and there's no reason why the physiology would be any different in the bone of the horse. So I got very involved with that product, and over time developed my own product that we use for increasing bone and collagen production, and it is a biologically available form of silicon. So it's very well researched, and actually Brian and I are getting ready to do another study in the summer where we're going to look at some other markers for bone and collagen using biologically available silicon. And that's something that that we need to get the word out a little bit better about, is that we have very successfully dealt with bone disorders and certain defects in the field in response to using the biologically available silicon. So it's not just for young animals, it's for old as well. I mean, you're always making new bone until the moment you cease to breathe. So it's something that can be used for a lot of different situations in a variety of different horses. Immunity, that's I haven't really done a lot of work in the immune area, but we deal with a lot of horses getting sick all the time in these very micromanaged environments. So one of the things that I've looked at, which I think had a lot of decent clinical research behind it, was the use of beta-glucan, and it comes from a variety of different things, but the one that I was most interested in is when it comes from the yeast cell wall. Beta-glucan from yeast cell wall has been shown in some studies to really help potentiate and modulate the immune system and uptick in macrophage and dendritic cell activity. And those are the scavengers that go out and look for pathogens that are in the horse. So again, something to just think about for if you have chronic infections, horses that are getting ready to go into a very intense level of training and moving around quite a bit, or horse that has had, chronic reproductive problems that are always infected. There are certain things that we can do to help that horse above and beyond what we just feed them on a daily basis. There is some nutrient targeting that we can do to help deal with preventing infections and also dealing with chronic infections. Okay, I see a question here. Where does beet pulp fit in this? Okay, yes, beet pulp we use a lot now in place of grain, and it is considered a super fiber. Should it be used to increase the calories in the ration? If so, to what limit? Yeah, we've always said that the super fibers like beet pulp have similar caloric value as similar to oats. So we can supplement we basically can do rations now that just really are devoid of all grain and use things like beet pulp in place of it, and oil. So the oils are very calorie dense. They're 2.5 times more calorie dense than carbohydrates. So it's very easy now to put together rations that have the same kind of calories that they used to in the old-fashioned sweet feeds, but we do it through things like beet pulp and soybean hulls, alfalfa meal, and oils. So that's a good question. Yeah, beet pulp is very, very useful in horse diets. And let's see, what else? We've covered the growth, bone, metabolic. There's an interesting area that I'm starting to look at now for the colonic problems in the hindgut. And there's actually some things that the horse normally produces, an amino acid called glutamine, and then a volatile fatty acid called butyric acid. Those are two things that the horse naturally produces, but in times of very high stress, their ability to produce it themselves becomes limited, and they don't produce it in high enough concentration And both are responsible for maintaining the integrity of the lining of the colon. So the amino acid glutamine actually helps to keep the spaces between the cells very tight in the intestinal tract, and butyric acid, again, is a VFA produced from microbial fermentation. But that's a pretty potent food for the colonic cells. It's an energy source for them, and it also has a pretty good anti-inflammatory effect. It helps to improve the length of the villi, which are the little fingers that increase the surface area of the intestinal lining, which helps to improve the space where nutrient absorption can go on. So I've been looking at that a lot lately. I see a lot of this going on in human nutrition with all these people that have Crohn's disease and inflammatory bowel. And really, we're dealing with very similar situation in these horses. They basically have the same kind of problems. And again, it comes from stress and high cortisol levels, bad diets, infrequent feeding, long periods of time with nothing to eat. They basically have the same kind of clinical symptoms as people with inflammatory bowel disorder. And so that's an area that I'm looking at now. Putting together some nutrient targeted products that will help with improving the health of the colon, and along with really good quality high fiber diets, we should be able to immensely help these horses move along and be healthy. And my whole goal with the nutrient targeting program, the Equi-Force product line, is really to give the horses the building blocks or the raw nutrients that they need, even though some of them may already be provided in the diet, or maybe things that they naturally can make themselves in their body. There comes a certain time where they have to be augmented and supplemented with exogenous sources of these nutrients. And so we're basically looking at using nutrition therapeutically by giving the horse the raw materials to fix the problem, instead of constantly using pharmacological agents to just simply mask symptoms. So my whole goal with everything that I do, with all of these programs and nutrient products that I'm putting together, is to try to fix the problem or minimize the problem or eliminate it altogether, so that we use less and less pharmacology to just mask a symptom. And I think that's all I really had planned, but I'm happy to answer a lot more questions if there are any. Anybody else?
All right, thank yous, and this has been awesome, and go from there. I do have a couple of questions here for you if you want to go over those. One says, I have a young horse in training. He gets out about 6 to 8 hours a day, and when he's in the stall, he has grass, usually has hay in front of him, alfalfa grass mix.
Right.
He's also a pretty easy keeper. However, he seems like he has more of an upset stomach and wants to chew on wood when he's outside, even when there's grass or hay in front of him. Is that something that's diet related or just behavior related, or do you have any insights on those?
Well, I think all horses should be allowed to chew on wood. I mean, that's just a natural thing that they normally would do. And they like to eat dirt. There's a lot of good stuff in the dirt. If you remember really what a horse would eat if it was turned out on 100,000 acres, it would walk about 30 miles a day, and it would be eating sticks and leaves and branches. It would browse on tree branches and sparse, very low quality grass and a lot of bark and a lot of dirt. So that's just a natural thing for a horse to eat. There's nothing to worry about. If you don't want them eating your stall, it's good to, do something to not make it out of wood, or put some metal around where the areas that they're eating. But, we used to put some brackets up and just give them a 2x4 pine board to chew on if you don't want them eating your stall. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It saves your stall and it makes the horse really happy. But yeah, eating wood is pretty normal. Um, the only time you have to worry, that being said, Chad, you know, if you have a horse that's stabled and doesn't have anything else in front of it to eat, it's going to eat wood shavings and it's going to eat a lot of wood, and that's abnormal. Okay, that would not be considered an okay thing, because too much of a good thing is not good, as we know. So, you know, a horse being outside free ranging, you know, for 6 to 8 hours a day, nibbling on some tree trunks that have come down or limbs, that's fine. A horse that's consuming large amounts of wood in the stall and eating shavings is not okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
Sue asks, it's just that this is being recorded. Yeah, you will have access to this recording later on. You should get an email, I think tomorrow, just with some details on that, and it'll be on the website after that as well too.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to, you know, send me an email or whatever, obviously I can only cover so much, and I don't really, you know, I can't answer everybody's question right here, but I'm perfectly happy to, you know, shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to answer your question, whatever it may be. I'll try to help you out.
Great. I have another question here. Horse has grass laminitis. You know, obviously a hard time keeping weight off them. What's, you know, you said no muzzle and no restriction or you know, limit those, but what's the best way to, you know, still feed them without, you know, getting fat and also reduce, you know, the chances of you know, reoccurrence on that?
Yeah, those are, when you get to that stage, you're in a pretty tough spot, but again, the ideal thing would be to, and you may progress out of this at some point, but you're going to have some sort of sacrifice lot where you've got no grass in it whatsoever, and find some forage that is pretty low quality, and utilize the slow feed. You know, you don't want to torture the horse with slow feed. You just want to be able to make sure it's eating it a little slower than it normally would. The biggest problem is we've created these behavioral issues with you know, really gorging on the food and eating it as fast as possible, and the horse doesn't have to walk around at all to get it. The more creative you can be with that horse, the better. You know, and again, I don't know the specific horse or what condition of the hooves, you know, how much rotation there was, whether this horse is ever going to be serviceable again, or if it's just now just a pet. But, you know, and again, that's something that would require a lot more information for me to advise. But the main thing is to reduce the amount of stress in the horse's body and its head, and then feed it correctly for whatever type of horse it is. If it's an overweight horse, you need to go with a ration balancer and a lower quality forage that you can keep in front of them at all times, but keep them eating it at a slow rate. You just don't want them to go without forage at all. The muzzle, I created my own horse, became a cribber from being in a muzzle too much. And again, cribbing is very much an individual issue. I don't think that, you know, every horse that's in a muzzle is going to have some type of behavioral issue, but I have seen it happen in several horses where they just were so stressed out from the muzzle. So I really, you know, you could use the muzzle a little bit, but I'm not a fan of putting a horse in a muzzle and leaving it in a muzzle all day long. It's a tool that you can use periodically, I guess, for short periods of time. The main thing is if you can get that horse to exercise. That's the key to getting these horses past this laminitis stage and getting their insulin resistance lowered is exercise, low quality forage. And I mean, I really honestly believe that you've got to use the metabolic product in order to try to get that glucose insulin metabolism semi under control. So that's kind of the program. Dry lot, if you have to, you know, free range, but in a dry lot, available forage at all times, ration balancer, and the metabolic product, Metalibrium.
All right, great. I think that's all the questions we have right now. I just want to thank everybody for being on tonight, and thank Dr. Gill for a lot of great information. Again, if you have questions, you can send an email or go on the Facebook page and send a message through there.
Yep.
She'll be happy to get back with you on either way.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, again, thanks to everybody for coming on tonight. I know it's hard to get away from the horses and everything else we have in life, but hopefully we'll do more of these in the future as well too. And like I said, this one will be recorded, so we'll be able to access it at a later time as well.
And let us know if you have suggestions for specific topics for any more webinars. We're going to do some more, and we want to know what it is that you want to hear about. So let us know.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, everyone. Have
a good night. All righty. Bye.